Welcome everybody, welcome to the City Nation Place Latam Caribbean Conference. We're delighted to have brought together so many place leaders for today's session, and we're very much looking forward to hearing from everybody. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Claire Dewhurst and I'm the Director of City Nation Place. I'll be chairing most of today's sessions, but I will also be assisted by Filipe Torres, the CEO of Bloom Consulting, who are our organising partner for the conference.
Hello.
The first important thing to point out to you is that you can listen to this conference in English or in Spanish. Some speakers will present in English, some will present in Spanish, and in the background there will always be a translator. So below the live window where you can see me, you should see a tab saying translation on or translation off. So if you need translation, click on and you should hear the language that you need to hear. It's a first for us, so we have everything crossed that that's going to work as planned. With virtual events, you get out as much as you put in. So I urge you to make the most of the opportunity today to ask questions of our speakers in the live feed, which is again below our broadcast window, to join in the roundtable discussions that we have scheduled later, to make new connections through the networking platform, and to pop by our partner zones where there is a host of supporting materials and case studies that you might find useful. We hope you'll be very happy. The other rule of virtual events, even in Latin America and the Caribbean, is to stick to time. So I'm delighted that we have Jose with us. Jose leads Bloom Consulting, and he consults with governments and place brand teams around the world to create and implement place brand and marketing strategies. Bloom have been working really hard to understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the reputations of nation brands around the world. And so we're very grateful for him for putting together a presentation that shares the results of that study and how it relates to the region. After we've watched his presentation, there should be time for questions. So do please put these into the live video, into the live feed. But for now, we will watch Jose's presentation.
Hi, Claire. It's great to be back. It's the second year that we are the host organizer of City Nation Place Latam. And today I'm going to present you the impact of COVID-19 on nation brands. Now, we all know that crises affect brands in different ways. Sometimes you may have a crisis that is affecting a brand for a certain period of time, and then with time that will dissipate. So crises may or may not affect nation brands, but we felt the need to develop this study while this crisis is happening, and also to inform countries on how potentially and what are the big takeaways that COVID-19 is doing to their nation brands. I'm going to show you a deep dive on Latam, and some of the countries are actually here today, presenting today as well, and it's going to be interesting to talk about this. So to start with, I think it's important to outline that the study we did and the first big conclusion we took was, traditionally, when we analyze nation brands and the impact of whatever situation, either if it's a crisis or if it's an event, we called it touch points, how touch points affect nation brands, right? So a crisis is a touch point, right? So it's touched by it, it's a brand touch point, right? And normally when countries look into the impact of crisis into their, or whatever touch point it is, in their nation brands to see if this specific event is impacting or not, the simplification of this is you tend to analyze, like, if I have more positive mentions than negative mentions, right? Again, I'm oversimplifying it, but for the purpose of this explanation, let's just say it is like this. It's you put the more quantity on the positive perceptions versus the negative mentions, and voila, you understand how you are. Now, what the first conclusion of this study that gave us is that it's not so much like that. You have different crises and affect different brands and in different ways. So we understood that not every country is impacted by the crisis the same way. And this was a fascinating moment to do this. I mean, it's a terrible crisis, but from a nation brand perspective, it was the first time in history that you can analyze countries, everyone on the same plate, so on the same line, just So not even in war times you could do that, because there's some war in a specific part of the world, or there's a crisis, a humanitarian crisis in a specific part of the world. Here is like this was equal to everyone, right? So it was the first time that every country could be analyzed from a research perspective, from the same, exactly looking at the same scenario, right? The same environment. Because when nation brands, if you are in a specific part of the world, you say, well, that part of the world has a specific type of perception, and so on and so forth. Here, the situation was equal to everyone. So it was, from a research perspective, it was fascinating. So the conclusion we take is not every brand is impacted the same way by exactly the same type of touch points, in this case, by the crisis. So not every brand is impacted by the COVID-19 crisis exactly the same way. And we, to understand this, we created this, we understood this concept about the brand knot, right? So the brand knot tells you what is the ideal ratio that you have, or what is the minimum ratio that you have, or that your brand needs to look into. And when I say ratio, is positive versus negative mentions, to see your brand altered or unaltered, right? So this kind of touch point is a crisis. So it's a negative one. So the brand knot is going to be more demanding. So brands, nation brands, will need to be more resilient. And when you have positive touch points, of course, it's the other way around. You need to have, by default, because it's positive, it will impact positively the nation brand, right? So I'm just going to give an example how this theory is then applied into the research that we have here. So the study we did was a top of mind analysis, international analysis. We always excluded domestic perception. So we never asked someone, what do you think about how your country is managing the brand? But we asked, how do you think other countries are managing the brand? And you have this graph here where you have the net positive mentions versus negative positive mentions, so negative versus negative, positive versus negative. And on the horizontal line is the ratio, right? And these are the countries that were mentioned, and it was fantastic to see. These are the global countries, and this was fantastic to see that 140 countries were mentioned with a minimum mass, and then you have more, approximately 53 with a strong critical mass. But it was really interesting to see that a lot of people had a lot of opinions about countries, and this was a moment that nation brands were really being exposed much more than any other time. It was about countries. World, and then we started to do a deep dive more into Latam, right? And it was really interesting to see how specific countries were performing. And of course, the crisis, and when we did this study, the first wave was not yet hitting Latin America. But it was interesting to see as well was how well, for instance, Salvador, which was one of the countries that were mentioned more positively in the world, how they dealt with the crisis. So El Salvador is a brand that has a lot of a nation brand that is under stress constantly. And this specific event, as you can see here, this specific touch point was a positive contributor for the nation brand, because they behaved, let's just say, in the eyes of the world properly, or the way that they did was seen as the correct thing to do, the right thing to do in terms of management of the crisis. And of course, you have here Brazil, Mexico, and so on. Again, what's interesting to see, and the analysis we make is not, and what the brand knot, that line is going to tell you is, okay, how Mexico or how Brazil or how Salvador, how this has affected, what does this mean, basically? What is their brand knot? What is their line? What is their minimum line of what is the ideal ratio? Because it's different at El Salvador, because it has a specific perception. Then, for instance, you have Chile, or you have Mexico, which has a different kind of perception as an overall, as a nation brand. How is that legacy as a nation brand helping them to take this hit, let's put it this way, that is this crisis, right? Coming back to the reasons why people said Latin America did positive and managed the crisis positively and negatively, right? So on the Latin America, the perception was, it was like the constant effective measures, the isolation. Also, the negative reasons was, underestimating the threat. While the world, these are the negative and the positive reasons. So it's just to compare how the two, how Latin America is compared with the rest of the world, right? And what we see is that Latin America has, as an overall, so the average of Latin America has a brand not of 154. What does this mean? 154 means that you have, you need to have at least 1.5 persons, let's just say it like this, saying positively things or thinking positively of how Latin American countries did to neutralize the effect of one person with a negative perception. Right? So this is the brand not. The brand not is this number, the 154 here, that tells you, look, Latin American countries in general, the average of Latin America, your number is 154. So if you are a governmental leader, if you want to understand what is the ratio that you cannot be under, is this number. So this is the line. This is where you as a nation brand can play, or let's just say that you cannot go under this number. If you start to go under this number, your brand starts to be negatively affected. Okay, so this is to say that whenever you, an analogy of a race, if you like, you're starting a little bit before, when you have to start the race of nation brands, if you like, in terms of perceptions, you're starting 1.54 before the in a normal circumstance. Okay. Now, so this is the line, right? But then, what is the performance of how that how countries are doing? Now, this average you see here, the 154. If I look and I make it always this analysis from a deep dive into Latin America, of course. And by the way, 154 is way better than the world average. World average is 1.8. But when we start looking at the dimensions of the country brand wheel, you can see that both the dimensions, if you like, that were affected by the COVID-19 crisis or this analysis are the talent dimensions. And this is equal to the world. The world is, and what you can see here is like, this is the average of the world, and this is how Latin America is. So the dark purple is Latin America, the light purple is the world, right? And you're better in general than the world. Latam is better than the rest of the world. But still, of course, these are the dimensions, the talent dimension, the ones that got most affected. So what we're trying to show here is the crisis or the brand or the audience that is more sensitive to how countries are dealing with the crisis are the ones that are the audience from the talent dimension. So the talent dimension, study, live, and work, right? So if you look at the global citizens, the ones that are thinking to relocate or to study in a specific country are the ones that will be more affected how countries are dealing with the crisis, right? Less so on the visit, on the tourism side, and on the buy side. So from the business perspective, so the product and the country of origin effect. So a product coming from that country was less affected than if I want to live or study in that country. So this is the overall, this is like the lines that countries need to look into, right? But the study and what's important to analyze is that each country has their own brand knot. So because I was giving you the average, right? So each country has their own brand knot. And when we analyze the brand knot and when we analyze those countries there, this is the same graph as I've shown, the big one that I've shown, but now applied with each country with the red line, let's put it this way, what is the red line that each country has to see their brand altered or unaltered. So you see, for instance, that Brazil has a negative brand knot, but Argentina no. Argentina as a brand was more resilient than the rest. You have El Salvador, like I said, is a brand that is constantly under stress. So as a nation brand, so of course the red line is more on the right. So the starting point for El Salvador is not as possible or as good as the Argentina one. And the analysis we do here is how El Salvador, in the case of El Salvador, how they perform facing that. So the starting point of El Salvador is not so good as, for instance, Argentina, but it is way more positive, the result on how they perform facing their own brand knot, right? So now let's look into the overall. So this is the nation brand as a whole, how nation brands were affected as looking into their brand knot. So the starting point for everyone is that red line, and then how you perform facing that red line is what's important to constantly measure. So well done, El Salvador is really the country that did best in terms of perceptions. For tourism, then you look into the buy from and then on in each dimension, and you have the study from. And this changes very much basically on each dimension. And what's important to show and to conclude out of this study is a couple of things. As we know, the same crisis, again, this is the first time this was ever possible to do, which was analyze every country in the same situation. So from a nation brand research point of view, this was unique, and unique time in history that you could do this. And what you can analyze is that, so not every brand, nation brand, is affected the same way by the COVID-19 crisis. And each brand has a minimum, so that's the brand not, and you have to look into that minimum to see if your brand is affected. And the stronger your brand is, the better it is for you, and the more resilient you are. So the more resilient you are as a brand. So this is something that the study was showing. And it's really important that countries understand that managing their brand, and in Latin America, managing their brand and have their nation brand as in the core or have as a priority for the nation is important for the nation as a whole, from an economic point of view, from perception point of view that then affects, of course, the economy. Is important that countries pay special attention to nation brands, especially in the times that we're living in right now. So that's my big recommendation, and that countries need to pay attention, and especially for the future to come. This is something that they have to pay and have to start looking at this not as something as a beauty contest, but much more as a national asset that should be managed and properly dealt with. So when we look into the work and live, this is also the same. Mexico, of course, took the hardest hit here. But when we put this into a ranking and look into, in the case of Latin America, clearly you can see how well El Salvador did in terms of mentions for nation branding, and how other brands, for instance, did. But this is to say, just well done, El Salvador. This was a very important achievement, I think, for the nation brand. And this is, I have to say congratulations, because the way you dealt with the crisis impacted positively the nation brand. Thank you. I'm open for questions, Claire.
Thank you, Jose. There's quite a lot of detail in that presentation. I know that's why you wanted to present it beforehand, so that you could make sure that you got everything into the time. And I'm sure that people will have questions. I have a question before anybody else. Were you surprised by some of the results? El Salvador obviously performed very well. Why do you think that was?
I think this is what we call the combination of things on how countries behave. In the end, is what builds the reputation of the country and the perception of the country. This specific thing was something that was very well managed. Let's just say it this way: El Salvador behaved in a way that resonated with the rest of the world, and specifically in Latin America. So it's really interesting to see that. Although countries may have a specific position on normal, let's just say, traditional country brands, but in their micromanagement actions, they may perform very, very well. So that's what's interesting to also see this. So that's I think, the interesting takeaway.
And then what do countries do about it? So having gathered this data, what is your advice to countries on how to improve their brand note?
Yeah. So the first thing is to understand this brand not language is something that, although it's a technical jargon, I think it's an important way to explain to policymakers and to leaders to understand this whole thing about the ratio. What is the right ratio for that may impact or may not impact the brand, right? The nation brand. And for everything we do. So it's not just as a big nation brand not, but it's like, okay, if I'm going to do this specific policy, what is going to be the brand not? How much this is going to help or hinder us, right? So I think that countries, if they look this, they should take this brand not into consideration on the things they do, and also to constantly measure and monitor the brand performance, their nation brand performance, and how they're doing in terms of nation branding, and also to look out for the nation brand. I think this whole thing about the pandemic, what it showed was that how the ones that have the strongest brands are the ones that were more resilient on all this. So I think it put the conversation about the importance of managing your brand in the first level.
Having a brand strategy that will make you more resilient when a crisis hits.
Exactly.
I understand. Makes perfect sense. So I'm going to hand over to you now to introduce our next speaker, because you are able to speak Spanish, and I sadly
yes,
am
I
not.
am. I will start in English and then I'll go to Spanish.
Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you, but I will be back to see everybody shortly.